And her other big project during those same years, I guess, was Walnut Hill. Was getting that together. Now, did she talk to you about how Walnut Hill came to be when you were a kid?
Well, what she did was she didn't say anything to me. She just let me wander. And one day, I wandered across the creek and up the hill, and there was the school. And I came back, and I asked her, "There's a school there?" And she told me, "Yes, your father, your uncle, all my sons went to that school. That's Walnut Hill." And I was like, "What?" But yeah, that was our community school. And we raised the money. You know, your grandfather wasn't making more than about $1 a week. And basically what we would do is that he got paid in pennies, and we would put it into a fund to help to get the Rosenwald man to come here and basically put up a school. Because we were going to get these kids out of here. We were going to get them educated. We weren't going to let them have the type of life that we had. You know, she recognized that there was a lot more that was available. She didn't ever apologize for or feel that she didn't have a good life, but she was very focused on the future. And part of that is that I got a habit from her, or a characteristic from her, that I treasure to this day. She was always observant. She was always looking. She stayed awake. She was always, and as a result, when I was in college, I'd come home because my mom and dad were in Africa. My dad was in the embassy over in Liberia. So this is where I came. And I would tell her, you know, all of my stories. And, you know, the context for them, how did she understand? But she would listen intently. Fascinated, I think, by the fact that I was fascinated by what I was talking about. And I would just talk about it. You know, I'd get into some very heavy conversations about what was going on and what school was like and professors and all that. She had formed a friendship with Mrs. Mixon at Mixon's Brothers Grocery. And she did some work for her, ironing, that sort of thing. But she paid close attention to the Mixons. They represented upper middle class. And she looked at the lifestyle. And when you look at the home, we have much of the furniture, beds, and all that. She duplicated that lifestyle. You know, you didn't have to have money to have an attitude of wealth. She had an attitude of wealth. And it's in the home that we've restored. You see it. The quality that she's put into the things that were important is what I noticed in the flooring, in the walls, some of the things that she bought, the sewing machine, the furniture, the beds. All of those things reflect a certain level of, you know, we're somebody. We believe in ourselves. We stand for something. And it didn't matter what the paycheck showed or how the fact that, you know, my grandfather worked in the woods. And on top of that, I mean, he had maybe a 6th grade education. He was a trustee at the school board for Walnut Hill School. They did not need proof of who they were. They just were those people. And they expected you to be like that. They expected you to represent yourself accordingly. And I respect that so much. I'll never forget my grandmother. This is actually a true story. My grandmother, you know, grandparents, there's no doubt about it. I was selling myself to my grandparents. And so they competed for my attention and my time. And I remember I was just waxing on about how poor my grandmother was, how poor Arvetta was, how they didn't have a nickel to rub together, how they, were just farmers, and how my grandparents, my mother's parents, were business people, had a funeral home, were doing this, and they had money, and my grandmother, she finally had enough. She said, stop it. I said, Arvetta and Ben aren't poor. They're just filling your head with mush. I said, there's no way they're poor. And the fact of the matter is that they didn't have any money, but they had such an attitude. And I think my grandparents on my mother's side had such respect for Dad. And Dad came from Arvetta and represented that. And they said, oh no, we know better than that. We're not buying that. Poor old us.
How close were you to going to Walnut Hill? I mean, that was closed up and wasn't in use even as a community building by the time you were.
Yeah, there was no consideration of me going to Walnut Hill. I mean, I had lived from California to Washington to Panama, and I'd lived in military housing, and I was. It was integrated. I represented the future. I represented what they had all striven for me to become. Walnut Hill closed in '63, and the kids were transported into Kirbyville. They lost control of their school system, their school, and it basically shut down. What happened to the building, we don't know. But it looked like Rosenwald schools all across the country. But my cousin Alton died a couple of years ago in a car accident. He actually restored the house. We share the same great-grandfather, Benjamin Wright. He was like in the last class that went to Walnut Hill, and he's a couple years older than me, and that it closed down when he was in the 3rd grade. So my opportunity to go to the school, it never happened. But once I got the idea of the school, and the fact that it had educated everybody from my dad's generation up to Alton, who was my age, I said, wow. And when I got the idea of Booker T. Henry and the famous things that he said, which blew me away, the only time you have to do something is now. That was his famous saying. To this day, I operate by that. The only time you have to do something is now. It created for Dad a sense of urgency in his life that he needed to get things done now. And that's how Arvetta worked. She was about, let's get this done now. We have a sense of urgency. It's the message that I give to my daughters. The only time you have to do something is now. Getting present is really what it's about to me.